Welcome to Hope Reviews. I'm basically just going to talk about some of the books I read in 2020 and give you mini reviews if I think they're worth it or they're not. I did, according to Goodreads, 50 books this year. I'm not going to do all of them, but here's some highlights. So I read Nutshell by Ian McEwan, who's an author I really love. He wrote Atonement, which became a really good film. Nutshell is really interesting and good. It is written from the perspective of a very intelligent fetus growing in the mom's body and listening to everything that's happening around it. And it's kind of a fun ride. I read An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, and I really liked it. It's one of those books that got a lot of hype, and I think kind of well-deserved hype. It's a really good look into a marriage in America between two Black people and having to deal with the incarceration system when you're falsely accused and how that completely ruins your life and how two people deal with it, one in the prison system and one outside of it. I read The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. Donna Tartt is one of my favorite authors. Every time I read her stuff, I think it's so good. I told a bunch of friends like funny scenes from it while I was reading it. Highly recommend anything from Donna Tartt. The Little Friend is really good. There's a really fantastic funny scene involving, actually there's several funny scenes involving snakes, and I do really recommend it. I read some releases of Snotgirl, which is a comic by Bryan Lee O'Malley and Leslie Hung, and I love the art style. I really like this series because it's funny and fashionable, and there's this weird almost probably supernatural element, and you're often not super sure what's happening or why it's happening or how. House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski is probably my book of the year. I recommended it to everyone essentially when I was reading it, and especially after. It is one of those books you have to read the physical copy of because it uses the formatting in really unique ways and uses the page turn in unique ways. It's super good. It's a massive book. I think it's decently expensive for being a paperback, but it's super worth it, especially if you're interested in documentaries or films, because it reads like a movie because you're essentially reading a movie in ways. It's super good. It's really good. I read The Book of Essie by Meghan MacLean Weir. This was a Book of the Month Club book. I think I got it secondhand at a friend's library sale. I used to do Book of the Month, but then I have a lot of books. So while it's a good deal and I really like Book of the Month Club, I don't need a book coming to me every month. I already have too many books. But because I saw it was Book of the Month, I was like, oh, generally these are good because they're curated picks. But The Book of Essie was fine. I gave it 3 out of 5. 3 out of 5 to me is this is an average middling book. I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it, but if someone's reading it, I wouldn't be like, ugh, that book is garbage. It just felt very cliche, and it was just fine. I don't know. It's very much one of those things where it's Christian girl has to deal with the world being garbage or other people being garbage, and how she deals with that. And I don't know. It's fine. I read Uncommon Type, Some Stories by Tom Hanks. I was kind of really excited for this. I think I had a signed edition. Because Barnes & Noble will do signed editions as instead of doing a Black Friday sale, they'll do signed editions for the regular hardback price. I give this 2 stars because there's there's 1, maybe 2 short stories out of the entire book that are at all vaguely interesting. Most of them are super boring or a cliche or just nothing burgers. So sorry, Tom Hanks. Maybe don't be a writer. Gina Wohlsdorf's Security. I don't know where I got this from. I don't know if I picked this out because it sounded interesting or if someone gave it to me. This book is super fun. I gave it 4 stars, and it's a heist almost movie, a break-in cut between kind of a old romance being rekindled, but it's all told through the view of security cameras in this massive hotel that's about to open but hasn't opened yet. So it's kind of just the cast of characters are the people who work there. It's super... I really loved it. It has really sweet moments. There's surprises. It was really good. I read a classic, The Reader by Bernhard Schlink, which I gave 3 stars. I liked it. I definitely didn't see where it was going, especially towards the latter third or half of it. And I knew nothing about this going in, even though it's a movie and it's a pretty well-known book and film. And it's good. It's definitely good. I really like John Krakauer stuff. I've only read, I think, one other book by him, but every time I see his name, if it's a book like on sale or something like that, I'm definitely interested because I think he's a really well-written, investigative reporter. I read his Under the Banner of Heaven, which talks about the Mormon Church, and it goes into kind of the history of the Mormon Church as well as this weird, extremist sect in parts of out in the Western United States. And it's a wild ride. There's a bunch of historical stuff about the Mormons, and I learned so much. Not all of it was necessarily a super interesting driving read, but I learned a lot, and I was definitely interested every time I was like, oh, I have time to read that. I want to find out more. So I gave this book to Ian's dad, Scott, years ago as a gift because I'd heard really good things, and I'd heard it was essentially like reading a Wes Anderson film, and he loves Wes Anderson, and that's The Family Thing by Kevin Wilson. And I gave this 4 out of 5. It is now a film, which I didn't know until I got on Goodreads to add it to my reading list, and it had the film cover. I like this. This is super fun and interesting, and kids who are now adults dealing with the fact that their parents are these experimental performance artists who are kind of batshit crazy, and just how you deal with how your parents raised you, and especially when you're raised in a non quote unquote traditional way, and just weird parenting. And I always love adult kids having to deal with their parents and reconcile with that. I read George Takei's They Called Us Enemy, which is a graphic novel about his time as a child in the detainment camps where American government rounded up all the Japanese people during World War II and put them in camps. And I knew very little about that time, especially that specific part of it. And I knew that he had grown up in those camps, but this was really interesting to see kind of what it was like living there. Definitely recommend. I think a lot of times in America, we don't like to think that our country has done bad things since slavery, and we definitely have. So I think we need to more openly reconcile with that and acknowledge it. I read Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley, which of course the film is fantastic. I found out later that this is at least a trilogy or a series now about Mr. Ripley. So I just read the first one. I'm not super interested in reading any more of them. I gave it 3 stars. Definitely there are parts of the film that are ripped directly from the book, and so I kind of always like having that visual sense, especially when it's a part of the world or, society that I don't have a good mental image for. I like it. I think it was really interesting because it was essentially written from Ripley's point of view, so you get the mentality of someone who is like that. I think it's worth reading. I read Nathan McCall's To Be Black in America is to Walk with Fury, which you, and I didn't know this, should have read some of his previous work kind of before reading this. He references them. But it was really interesting to have that point of view. I think I'm not alone in having read more Black literature, specifically dealing with African Americans living in this country and their experiences this year. I'm not alone in expanding my knowledge on that. And this was a very interesting one. And it's very short. So when I was a kid, when I was in middle school and early high school, Demetri Martin was probably my favorite comedian. I just thought he was so funny, and I really liked having the visual sense of his humor that isn't just slapstick. So he put out a book called This Is a Book by Demetri Martin, and it has some art, and I really love the cover, and I bought it a long time ago, and I finally read it this year, and I gave it 2 stars because it is definitely really dated humor, and I have found that along with reading Minnie Kaling's Everyone Hanging Out Without Me book also this year, where sometimes humor doesn't age well, and this was really one of those cases. I don't think Minnie Kaling's aged as badly. I think it's also more modern, but this was not a great one, and it quickly went in the donate pile. I gotta talk about Artemis by Andy Weir. I, like everyone else, have read The Martian. I liked The Martian. I think The Martian got more hype than it deserved, but I did enjoy it. I gave Artemis 3 stars because there are parts of it I really like. I really love a heist kind of thing, and so this has that. I like the space stuff, even though I'm not a big sci-fi person or even a big space person, as much as I do love Star Wars and now Star Trek, at least The Next Generation. But because he's writing from a female point of view, there are moments that I'm like, no one is saying or thinking these things. It's written in first person. And I just remember being like so grossed out by this one moment where she's in like a spacesuit and she pulls the like water tube that has a nipple on it to get water. And she says something about like, don't get excited. It's just to get water or something. And I just felt like it was so unnecessary. The character's supposed to be this like hot, very sexy and sex positive driven character, but you don't necessarily always see that reflected in her actions and thoughts. And I feel like Andy Weir just wrote like his dream girl in some weird way and doesn't understand women maybe. I really didn't like most of it. I didn't like the parts that I didn't like really tainted the book for me. Everything else in the book I actually thought was pretty good. I finally read Kathleen Rooney's Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk, and I really did enjoy it. I gave it a 3 out of 5, so maybe really is too strong. But it was interesting because it's essentially all taking place on one night. I believe it's New Year's night. And Lillian Boxfish is now an older woman living in New York, and she goes to like where she always gets dinner in a local place and all this stuff. But it's mostly taking place as like her memories of her life and her going through her interesting life. And I really do love character-driven books, and this is definitely one of them. Another author I really love is Shirley Jackson, who is probably best known for writing The Lottery, the short story, and The Haunting of Hill House. I also really like all her short stories. I read a collection of those a few years ago. I read Life Among the Savages this year, which is kind of short stories, but it's all memoir-esque, and it takes place when her kids are younger-ish. They're like proper kids, and she's the mom, and the kids are very funny, and I just really love slice of life stuff, and she's such a fantastic writer. I definitely gave it 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. I finished Sex Criminals. They finally released the last volume along with 2 extras, like little standalones, which is Sexual Gary, and then number 69, which is like the epilogue. I really loved Sex Criminals. I've told Ian like kind of the premise, and he thinks it sounds dumb, and I don't disagree with him, but it is done so well. The love story feels really real in it. It really does parts remind me of me and Ian. I think that's definitely part of the reason I love it. The writing is really witty and funny. The art is quite good. I really enjoyed it. I even really enjoy the epilogue, even though I think the epilogue is like a bittersweet ending kind of thing. No spoilers. But yeah, Sex Criminals is finally done, so if you're someone who wants to wait until a graphic novel or a comic series or anything is actually finished, it's now ready for you. Dennis Lee Haynes' Shutter Island is super good. I saw the movie in theaters when it came out, so it's been a few years, and I'd had this book because obviously the movie's really good, and I finally read it. It was really good. 4 out of 5. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I knew the twist the whole time, and it was still just as thrilling, just as interesting. Knowing the twist didn't ruin it, which I think is kind of like a really good indicator of good writing. It was really good. It handled mental illness, I think, maybe not like correctly, I don't know, but it handled it in a way that felt very accessible. I read Stephen King's On Writing, which is a memoir about writing and has kind of his rules of writing, and he almost teaches it like a class because he used to be a teacher, an English teacher, and I liked it a lot. I don't know how much I think it helped me as a writer because I write in a very different style than he does, but the parts where he talks about his life and his growing up and kind of how he got inspired by stuff and his like quote unquote career from early on being a writer as like a child was really interesting. And I like his writing style on a lot of things. I think Stephen King is a very interesting guy. Paula Hawkins wrote The Girl on the Train, and she put out another book, her second book called Into the Water, which again is a few years old now. Into the Water, I have 4 out of 5 because I think she has interesting stuff, and I think her characters are interesting, and I think her plot twists are generally good and not super obvious early on. But I don't know if I think it's better than Girl on the Train. I don't know. She definitely fits that niche of that type of writing where if you liked Girl on the Train or like Gone Girl or any of those, this would also fit into that niche for sure, and you would enjoy it. I read Grant Ginder's which I always want to say Grinder. The People We Hate at the Wedding, which I think I mostly picked up because I thought that the title was funny and it sounded vaguely interesting. I give this 3 out of 5 because it's super middling. I'm realizing now that maybe I'm looking back harsher on these books and maybe too kind when I rate them. This book wasn't a slog, but I was never really excited to pick it up. The characters are so vastly unlikable, and you'll get glimmers of them being like kind of likable and relatable, but largely I just kind of didn't care what happened to them. And so like the wedding is only the very end of the book. The People We Hate at the Wedding, spoiler alert, is the fucking main cast of characters because they mostly suck. Another book by Ian McEwan, I read The Comfort of Strangers, and this book, which is decently short, it's probably more of a novella, is really, really starts out so kind of boring. You're like, what is this? And then the twists start and they don't stop. And you're like, what? What is happening? They did what? And it's really good. It's pretty good. It's a 4 out of 5. I read Roald Dahl's Going Solo. I read Kid, I think a year or two ago. And these are essentially short memoir-esque moments. And Going Solo focuses on his time in World War I as a pilot. I learned a lot about... Not a lot. I learned some about kind of the airplanes of the time and England's air fighting especially in parts of Africa. And Dahl is just such a lovely writer, and the way he writes is so kind of joyful, the way he describes things. Even though he's writing more memoir stories in this and in Kid, you don't lose that his type of writing, his style of writing, which it's literally a classic, his writing style. I started watching the Scientology series that showed up on Netflix, which is apparently a few years old and was originally aired elsewhere, but it's the Leah Remini one talking about Scientology and interviewing ex-Scientologists and all this stuff, and I just marathoned it over a week or so. And so I picked up her book, Troublemaker, Surviving Hollywood and Scientology. She writes like she speaks, so that was really a joy. I did it as an ebook. I think I would have liked it even more as an audiobook, and I did enjoy it. I gave it 4 out of 5. There are definitely parts of Scientology she talks about, and there's definitely parts of Hollywood she talks about, but it is more than anything, I think, a memoir on her life. But she's interesting, and if you like that kind of thing, then it's definitely a good read. I am definitely a fan. And the last book I read this year, which is kind of a bummer because I gave it 2 out of 5 and I didn't like it. It was a slog to me. It was Chrome Yellow by Aldous Huxley. And I like so many books where essentially nothing happens. But in this one, essentially nothing happens and I'm not interested in anything or anyone. The writing is fine at moments. The writing is fine. I did tell Ian, I said, I don't want to say The Brave New World, which I quite liked when I read it, was a fluke, but maybe. That's probably too harsh, but I did not enjoy it. And those are the highlights of what I read this year with mini reviews. Hopefully you either got some ideas of what maybe to read next or what to stay away from if you were eyeing it. Thanks for listening.